This is Synopsis, a series of conversations led by XVIII Institute. Today's guest is Carlos Zárate. Carlos, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, Neja. Thank you for inviting me. Um, my name is Carlos Zárate. I'm a composer from Mexico City. I've been living in the US since 2021. I'm right now living in Chicago, in a, studying in a PhD program at Northwestern University with the composers Alex Mincek and J. Allen Jim. Um, and yeah, I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Lovely. As me too to you. So my first question is, how did you get to studying music? Is there a primary instrument you began with, or singing? And from
Mm,
that, how did you get to composition?
yeah. My background in that sense is not the usual for classical music. I didn't grow up playing piano. Um, I always was very musical. I was always using whatever I had close to me as percussion instruments when I was a kid, and I was always singing. But I had never any sort of formal training until I got into college. Um, I started studying music around 18 years old, I think. That's when I got into college and started playing piano. Well, I played piano, but I started like reading music from a staff. I started studying music theory, whatever harmony, counterpoint, like all the basics. But I always played guitar myself, electric guitar. I played keys. I always did this exercise of listening to songs and trying to learn the songs by ear, and like chose every time more challenging songs that were more difficult. So I think that trained my ear in a way. Um, so yeah, that's how it started.
How important do you see ear training at this point as a composer?
Very important. I think I have like mixed feelings about several things regarding composition, but one of those things is this primacy of the system over the actual oral experience.
Mm-hmm.
I Even though I am a composer that develops system and that like works with like very simple algorithms and does things that way, um, all the techniques I use are on the service of the like ultimate oral experience. So I think training oneself to hear or listen to things in a more rigorous way is very important. Um, I think your usual ear training that is taught at school is important, like to listen to intervals, to listen to chords, progressions. Um, all those things are very important, yes, but all those things are framed um, in a very specific framework of Western classical music, or however you want to call it, because I know like um, those terms are problematic, but I think composers should also train themselves to listen attentively in many other ways. We have examples of these kinds of approaches in the work of Pauline Oliveros and her like deep listening practices and stuff like that. So I think it should be a mix of like these more like formal conservatory like training and a different approach to listening to everything that's around us, to listening even to music, to being open to actually listening. Yeah.
So this is actually a very important theme to address as a composer, since first of all you're as well a listener as a composer, and you are well composing works to be listened to. So let's continue on this path of listening. What do you see certain? Do you see something specific that is this allowed by the formal way of listening, as we know it from our schools? Where do you think that specific listening is lacking? And also tying that to your own practice of composition. Do you work on that? Do you seek to resolve that? Or do you make yourself certain practices um, to reach past that?
Yeah, I think the main problem I see is that training is one compartmentalized and two like geared towards very specific things. We're listening to symphony and we're trying to catch all the moments in the sonata form. Or we're listening to a ritornello and we try to catch like when the theme comes back, you know.
Yes, yes.
It's very like very specific things. Uh, we are trying to make ourselves able to discern every possible interval and like when training is very rigorous to listen to all sorts of cadences and modulations and stuff like that, but not all music is tonal, for example. You know, not all music modulates the way this kind of music does.
Yeah.
So I think it's a training and it couldn't be. I mean, it could be a different way, but it will be very hard to actually, in 5 years of a bachelor's degree or 4 years of a bachelor's degree, it will be very hard to like actually encompass the totality of music. I don't even think that's possible in one's lifetime. But I do think it's like very focused. One could argue there's colonial forces embedded within that focus. That's a different discussion, but
Yeah.
uh, um, yeah, I try to listen in a way that I can discover how the music is working. Aim to I don't aim to learn how the composer intended it to work, but I try to discover how it is working for myself, if that means anything. Um, so it's an act of listening that is it's always thinking about my own composition and always thinking about how can I incorporate things that I find interesting in other people's music to my own composition. Um, so in that sense, I try to imagine how the music is working. It's not the most rigorous analysis exercise because I think the score plays a big role on that too, on the act of actually analyzing. Um, but it's a listening that is always trying to find different ways of making music and trying to decipher how that music is being made, or how it's actually working and how I can like incorporate it to my practice.
So it's many different types of listening there.
Yeah. I was reading one day the theories of a scholar that was talking about active listening and about like many other types of listening. And yeah, I think our brains are complex tools that are like making all sorts of operations simultaneously. So I think trying to like just simplify it to I'm doing this type of listening or I'm using this type of technique is not very accurate. I think our brains do a lot at the same time. to complete one task, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah, surely. And I mean, I'm guessing when a certain term is applied, at some point it might only apply prototypically, and
Mhm.
then further from and then with further I don't know, inquiries or research, you can devise more from that. But I was just I wanted to reply since just in the previous conversation with Guadalupe, also from
Mm.
Mexico.
Yeah, I know her. Yeah.
Yeah, you know her. So we were just addressing the listening. Now, what specifically was it? When you were saying, first of all, the intervals. You know, we are trained to hear intervals, but it's only certain intervals. Now, in
Yeah.
contemporary music, there's more and more. Actually, they're saying a lot of demand for hearing micro intervals, which before it only happened on the intuitive level. I don't know
Hmm.
at what point micro intervals were theoretically recognized, but certainly we know how scores looked like until certain era in 20th centuries, which is the smallest interval is half tone. So you know, when you say limited, I think of the fact that we're constantly playing microtones. That is, I'm a flautist, so in good in bad and in bad. so so we're constantly playing microtones, but uh, arguably, if using that lingo, a good interpretation means that one can intuitively or consciously understand the tonality so well that uh, all the microtones are correct, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, well, they are constantly there, but they are not recognized. Maybe today more. But yeah, so yeah,
And even then, there's like all sorts of different systems and frameworks and
yeah,
tunings to work with microtones in, so
yeah,
it's like
certainly.
I imagine that as a performer, that's even more challenging because like you're playing one day a piece that uses just intonation,
Yeah,
and on a different day a piece that uses an equal division of the octave,
yeah.
and yeah, I can imagine how challenging that is.
I mean, it's a whole new skill set, I guess, to be able to perform one of those,
Yeah.
really on point, and uh, and then you get a legit question of how precisely can you tune this, you know, to how many cents precisely can you tune, and I don't know, you know, it depends on so many factors right there.
And then
So
there's
yeah,
also compositions that don't take into account the actual perceptual reality of the human listening. So it's
yeah,
like you're asking me some things that won't have any relevance in the actual perceptual, yeah, reality, as I said.
yeah.
So yeah, there's many.
And then there's ensemble chamber music also. So
Yeah,
what happens with the 5 cents when there's another 7 cents happening there? Perhaps
yeah,
by plane or not by plane. So
yeah.
uh, but it's great questions to have out there on to have on the table, since yeah, we're obviously going to have to learn how to cope, how to uh, practice all those different kinds of intonations, tunings, listenings. Um, do you consider? Do you train your hearing uh, as a composer, or how how do you place? Um, Let me put it differently. This is the main subject of this conversation is compositional practice. And
Mhm.
I'm always curious what for you is a part of that practice, how widely or narrowly do you define it? Perhaps you can start with listening. Does it have a
Mhm.
place in your practice?
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's more of a daily act than um, an allocated um, day and time for me to practice ear training as I used to when I was in my bachelor's. I don't do that anymore, but it's more of an active um, attitude towards being aware of my surroundings, towards listening to music and all sorts of music, um, not only the type of music that I write. Uh, I try to find valuable things in all the different musics that I listen to. So I think it's more that like a constant act, and I'm not doing it like all the time. Like even though that is my intention, sometimes I'm just listening to music for the pleasure of it, or to dance, or to because there's also space for that. But in as much as I can, I try to pay close attention when I'm listening to a song, or when I'm listening to a piece, or when I'm standing on the train and like the sound of the train on the track creates a very dense mass of sound, and I don't know, I try to be aware of those things and how those things can inform my sensibility, I guess. Yeah.
It reminds me because in the end you refer to everyday sounds, right? Just listening
Mhm.
to everyday sounds like the train or in a subway or um, and it reminds me of first of all how one could say today therapeutic that
Mhm.
in itself can be and that quality or let's let's say just this impact of sound of music to someone's ears, do you consider that? How do you work with that, for example? um, I
Mm.
just gave an example of how a sound, not necessarily music, or if we maybe that is music, um, impacts someone. Do you have that in mind when you compose?
I think it's more. I think it that goes through the filter of myself. Like I think of what kind of sounds are pleasurable to me, and what kind of textures are I like listening to, and I I do consider the listener when I'm writing, but I try to consider them more in the sense of how a certain process is gonna work, and if it's gonna be like effectively perceived or not.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of like what you were mentioning, like the therapeutic uh, action of sound, or I think that definitely goes through the filter of my person and my sensibility. I don't think intentionally like, oh, this sound is gonna be pleasurable for the listener. It's more like I like these textures. I am trying to build these textures, but if I'm going to this point uh, and increase the grains, until this texture gets built, then I'm going to try to think how the listener is gonna perceive that over time. Um, and if I am taking too short of time in this like more minute place where there's less activity, or if I'm not doing the transition between those two states gradually enough, or then is when I consider the listener. Um, but in terms of like preferences or likes or yeah, it all goes through my sensibility.
So that brings us to time in music, because you were now immediately went to how much time is it from this to this point.
Yeah,
Uh, what's what do you conceive of time and composition?
I've been more concerned with time lately. I think it sounds ironic, but for the longest time I was not thinking about time, even when music is a phenomenon that happens throughout time. Um, for the longest time, I was not intentionally thinking about that. And then I wrote this like short paper for a class, and I started reading about different composers' thoughts around time. I read this paper by Fernanda about this flute piece and like how time works in that piece. I read um, many other things, and then I
Cassandra's
started.
Dream Song?
I'm sorry.
About Cassandra's Dream Song?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, I think it's called the tactility of time.
Hmm.
Um, I think if I'm not like conflating it with a different title, which I do a lot. Um, and lately I've been trying to incorporate that in like the consideration of time in my work. Actually, the last few pieces that I've written, the way they start is with this um, rhythmic process where I work with numbers in a way, but I don't want it to sound like I'm pseudo scientific about it, or that I'm mapping data into pitches or rhythms. No, that's not the case. I'm interested in um, how like different number series can create different curves of like behavior, rhythmic behavior, when you use them um, specifically in rhythm. How like you can get like bursts of like more activity or less activity just because of the way the number series work and how they grow exponentially or not, or um, so that type of thinking is rooted in our perception of time. And then like I'm like i I am doing these rhythm structures first in these last couple um, pieces. I use Sibelius to notate music, and the first thing that I get is this rhythmic skeleton with like no pitches and no dynamic marks and nothing else, just the attacks. Um, and then like I try to like I have already like a more or less clear image of how like that texture is gonna sound, or how is it gonna be. So I like stretch the time or compress it with retardandos, or with more like I will say like superficial ways of um, handling time, but the core of it is thought um, from the rhythms, from the like more like small cell of the rhythmic figures, and then I go and like devise another system for the pitches if I am going to use a system, or if not, like I go and place the pitches that I'm working with and the techniques that I deem um, usable and the dynamics and so on. So I've been thinking about time, but more imagining the sound as like a living entity that moves, and I'm trying for it to move in a way that feels like organic. Um, but yeah, that definitely is rooted in time. I know this might sound like very abstract because you cannot really see what I'm
Time is
referring to.
abstract, so
But yeah, yeah.
but to perceive something as organic, here we also bump into uh, the learned perception, and
Mm,
perhaps let's say the learned in again this music education of the
mm.
Western canon versus let's say everything else. um, so, what is it? Was it? What is organic movement? How do you address that? In
Yeah, it's I do it in a very intuitive way. I
Mhm.
am not interested at all in these for example, Xenakis that was like studying how gas particles moved and then used that as data for his pieces in a very rigorous and systematic way.
Mhm.
Um, I am not like that at all. I even though I love Xenakis' music and I see the value in that, I think we've gotten to a point where like trying to trying to understand music as science is like actually harmful for music and for the aesthetic experience, and it has like certain even political implications that I don't like. um, so I do it in a more like intuitive way because like I am in this same disposition to listening to my surroundings that I was talking about earlier. Like I also try to see what's going on around me, and I love how birds, like flocks of birds, move in the sky and how they like have these very like smooth um, movements, and they act as if they were one single entity when they are in reality a lot of birds, you know. That's what I mean with like organic movement. It's those type of movements that I'm trying to achieve um, gesturally, I guess, or like texturally even in my music. This is a fairly new endeavor, uh, but yeah, I think at least right now I'm approaching it in a more intuitive way. Yes, I'm using the numbers because I found that like the way they grow and the way they behave when I superpose different lines
Mhm.
um, with different series acting in different ways or just slightly out of phase. Um, I've seen that the way they grow and um, yeah, the way they behave kind of like resembles that type of movement that I am that I'm seeking for. So that is the strategy right now, but I don't know how it's gonna be in the future. I don't want to say I will never get more scientific about it. I don't know right now. I don't think that's my thing. Um, very probably I won't, but yeah.
So this scientific is being mentioned now. What prompted you to consider this distinction uh, of your own practice versus
Mm,
more scientific oriented practice?
yeah. Um, I think trying to understand music as science made sense briefly in a very specific moment in time. I am thinking in the story of um, this part of the world, of like the American continent, for example. I'm thinking about Milton Babbitt
Ah,
and and I really um, don't agree with many things said in that essay. Who cares if you listen? And I don't agree with many things, uh, many of the attitudes he had towards music, because I think he's a great example of this obsessive, um, this obsession with like understanding music as science. But then, if you place that obsession in the context um, it was on, it made perfect sense to me because Milton Babbitt was trying to get universities to recognize composition as like good enough for them to give doctoral degrees
yeah.
in composition. You know, for composers to have access to more budget, for composers to have access to all the resources that a university can provide. And I think the only way he found, and I think the only possible way back in the day for universities to recognize music as valuable enough as to grant doctoral degrees is uh, framing it as scientific, you know, because then it can produce a type of knowledge that is valuable for the society and for the university. Because, of course, the arts produce this intangible knowledge and this intangible good that is much harder to track and to value. Like most of us just think, oh, art equals good, but don't actually go deeper and try to understand why, because it's also hard, right? Like it's not producing any material good. It's not producing research that is relevant in a very immediate way to the development of technology or to cure diseases or you know. So I think back then it made sense to try to frame it in this like very scientific way and say like, hey, we're doing very rigorous work here,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we're going through the whole like scientific method to produce our pieces. um, but then to me that produced pieces that are not alive like I like music to be, or the way I like music to be. Like I don't like Milton Babbitt's music. um, I like other serial music. I love Bevern's music, you know. But I think there were other things in play in Bevern's music versus Milton Babbitt's music. So that's why I don't like this approach that like tries to understand music as science, because I think it deems very sterile music most of the times. Like the act of just mapping data into the different parameters of music, um, it's a kind of unexpressiveness that is not, that it doesn't seem intentional for me, because I am also about like I can uh, be on board for unexpressiveness if it's an aesthetic choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I think about Samuel Beckett and like all the composers that were like influenced by his ways of thinking about art, and I find value there. But when it's like just the system for the sake of the system,
Mm-hmm.
I often find that. to produce music that is not very appealing to me. And then there's also like the political implications of that, of one thing being like more valuable than the other, and like all sorts of like power dynamics that are a consequence of that, that just don't align with the way I see things.
So, speaking about an overview of paradigm at that time, what would you say would make sense as Babbitt's work made sense for that point in time? What do you see makes sense today to the current? Perhaps making a small peek into composition as a field, or but again, basing on your practice, on your composition. What is relevant to composition as a field that you seek to provide in your practice?
I think it's way easier to look back in time with
Yeah,
all
of
the
course.
like
Yeah,
all the resources that history provides,
certainly,
and
certainly.
then say what it. I don't think
I
I
know.
could say right now. I
Okay,
can say
okay.
I can say what's relevant to my practice as I've been doing. But yeah, I wouldn't dare to say
Okay,
this
okay.
because I'm also
I
like
take it back.
I'm also like 30 years old. Like I'm gonna look at this in 10 years, and I'll be like, you were on some bullshit, Carlos.
Uh, well, learning every day, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
that's the game. um, but look, sometimes I think even if just to uh, make a thought exercise, it's
Mhm.
great to do this.
Yeah.
But
And I make them in the privacy of my
oh,
brain. Like I try not to let those thought exercises go out because
okay,
you said,
compositional practice right there, huh?
yeah, exactly. And even then, I try not to advertise it in case it fails.
Amen. Okay. Okay. Then let's go to aesthetics. Is there a certain ideal that you work with in terms of aesthetics, and if yes or if no, how much does it impact uh, the way the methodology of your composition, and to that methodology itself? Is there a standard that you have in place, or is it a constant, ever-changing process?
I think it's an ever-changing process. I have things that I like, and that have stayed with me throughout the time I've been writing music. Um, I love these textures that are built of very small grains, and that like have like an inner behavior. I really love Georgi Ligitis music. I love Bad Footers music. I love that kind of textures, and I um, often seek to produce them in my own work. And those textures, like, also um, serve as a um, container for these other type of movements that I was talking about before. Um, I know those things are there. I In terms of like timbre, I like I seek for like the constructions of timbre through like different means. not only like techniques, like immediate techniques, but also um, harmonies or spectra, whatever you want to call it. So I know I have those tools that like work for me and my aesthetic sensibility, but I'm always well, not always, but I constantly like get new interests. Often those interests come from um, works of art that I witness in other disciplines. Like I like visual arts, or just like taking a walk on the lake. We have the Lake Michigan here in Chicago, and it's beautiful, beautiful, and it's like a great source of. Um, I don't like the word inspiration, but like for lack of a better word, um, and I think all those things like nature and like other living beings and yeah, also inform my aesthetic sensibility. But I don't have what's the word? Hmm. It escaped my mind.
Well, anyway,
You
I
know
was
these
asking
lists
also
of things
because,
that like
yeah, sorry.
no, Tim.
I was also asking because of reading or taking a glimpse at the master thesis and the orchestral work, which
Hmm.
is largely, uh, or let's say very tightly intertwined with the visual.
Hmm.
In that case, the photographies. Um, and then that impacted, in that case, the process of composition. So, if I understand correct, that is, let's say, one of the regularly occurring phenomena in your composition practice. So,
Yeah,
the visual has
yeah,
quite an impact in your
yeah. I
practice.
often find the exercise of um, taking one thing that works within a specific context and trying to make it work in a different context very nourishing. I find that exercise very nourishing, even like in small things. Like there's a piece of mine where I was it's kind of graphic in a way, and the material rotates between the instruments, but the graphic that worked in a certain way for one instrument, because of the way it's the other instrument is physically built and its capabilities, it's gonna have to be adjusted, and like it's gonna work in a slightly different way. um and I think the same kind of like mental process works too when I'm experiencing visual art. There's ways that visual artists think about the world and about their work too, that musicians or composers don't do so much. Um, like in the orchestral work that you mentioned, which was my thesis piece for my master's, I I used the work of these Venezuelan slash German artist Gego, and she was very like preoccupied with the idea of transparencies. And she was creating these huge sculptures. Well, not sculptures, because actually she didn't like the word sculpture, because in her head that made her think of a solid structure or a solid like object, and she's actually interested in transparencies, but it's like these structures made with wires that she will tie in different ways, and that because they are made with wires and they are not made with like solid sheets of material. They will let you see through the spaces that like result between the wires. So sometimes things that were not a certain way in a three-dimensional plane, when you see them just as a plane with two dimensions, they become a different thing. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but I was very fascinated by that. So I tried to like reproduce that with sound. And like one could argue that it's not gonna be like that, it's not possible to reproduce those kinds of things. But yeah, of course, I'm well aware of that. I'm just trying to find things of new ways of thinking about my music and about sound. So yeah, I found the visual arts to be very stimulating.
I mean, as uh, I, I do observe that I encounter some sort of basing or correlating compositional works to visual art, to the visual,
Mm.
very frequent occurrence when I speak to composers. And
Hmm.
also, if you look at the history, there's so many examples. And then there's also graphical notation, which in a certain way merges both, or just, yeah, a preliminary thought. I also did that in one of my own series of compositions where it would be always a short story, a drawing, and
Mm.
after that. So, and I would argue that in some sense, music is so abstract that as soon as you get something visual, especially if the visual has a stronger impact on an individual, that yeah, there's some sort of relief because of having that concrete image, something. It may be in your mind or actual image there, painting, print, etc.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Um,
Yeah, one of oh, I think I'm losing you.
yeah, test one, two,
Oh,
three.
you're there.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, like some of my favorite composers belong to the what was called the New York School. Think about Morton Feldman,
Mm-hmm.
um, Earl Brown, Cage, and so on. And yeah, they were deeply influenced by the painters of their generation. And I think that like not only influenced, but they were like peers with them. Like they were friends, and they will gather all the time, and they will like talk about painting and about art. And I think that that really informed their compositional practices and really set them apart from other things that were going on at the time in the like avant-garde, the European avant-garde. Um, so yeah, the visual is
But also,
definitely a part of
if I
music.
recall correct, in that time, it was much more common that, uh, first of all, composers were rarer.
Mm,
Those that were usually in the same social circles as the
mm,
rest of artists,
yeah,
painters, writers, such as Paris, Vienna centers, where everyone knew everyone, everybody knew
yeah.
everybody. Uh, but back to your compositional practice. Uh, what do you see as, first of all, when you, let's say, work with a source, with a source that you decide to integrate in your own practice, uh, what is it that determines, or perhaps what is the constant? What is in that practice? What constitutes that practice as you see it, as you conceive of it, always? So no matter which influence you had, what do you see as a constant in your compositional practice?
Hmm.
We basically already went through a couple of distinctions, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. There's certain types of textures. There's certain types of sounds that have been there with me since I started writing. Um, but in terms of like an attitude towards composing, I don't think that has been so constant. I think it has changed. Um, and I think it will keep changing. I do think there's a point in the life of an artist where like a more like mature and steady um, vision of what art should be like comes to them, but I think I'm far from that. So I yeah, it's been changing a lot. The things that worry me have been changing a lot. The prejudgments I have been changing a lot. I don't want to say I've gotten rid of prejudgments, but I've gotten rid of some and acquired new ones. Um, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's been like an ever changing process.
Mhm. And the mentors, your composition mentors. How do you see those impacting your development and studies in composition?
Yeah. I think there's a very I think there's a very toxic conservatory like culture around the figure of mentors going around in the world, which produces these established composers that are just trying to reproduce themselves in their students and like to like almost make photocopies of themselves, and like that always creates weird power dynamics. And but I've been very lucky to find people that have uh, walked this way um, next to me, and that have like guided me, and that have given me their perspectives. I've always tried to take everything everyone says to me with a grain of salt, and to make it go first through the filter of my intellect and my sensibility. Um, I when I was in Mexico, um, I was very lucky to get to meet this composer that later became my friend, Ivan Naranjo. He studied in Wesleyan and then went to Stanford, and I think he's one of the like one of my favorite Mexican composers of um, these times. And he introduced me to this more experimental side of composition, because my the school I went to undergrad for had this very specific way of thinking about composition that um, I never quite agreed with. So getting to meet Ivan outside of school and taking like lessons with him was very like was like a game changer, because he exposed me um, to the music of many composers that I hadn't heard of, and to their thinking, and to just a different way of thinking about music.
Mhm.
Um, then when I was in in Arizona, I met two professors that were very helpful and feel like family to me, because they were also Latin American. So from the beginning, I could feel their support and their guidance. They are Gabriel um, and Fernanda, Gabriel Bolaños and Fernanda Aoki Navarro. Excellent composers, great friends, and their guidance was more like on the side of how things work in the United States and how things work in academia, and like, these type of things. Um, Also, um, they also showed me, like, shared with me their attitude towards composition. Um, and then here in the PhD, I think things are way more hands off. I don't think I've found a mentor per se, or someone that like has worked with me, but I've had like excellent professors. Taking lessons with Alex Mincek has been really cool, because I think Alex and Wet Ink Ensemble have like really changed many things in the game, in music, at least in the United States. And this idea of having like an ensemble that has like performers who are also composers, and who are like playing these like very
Wet
interesting
inks,
music.
right?
I'm sorry.
That are playing wet ink, actually.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So
Like,
yes.
I think that that's very valuable, and I think Alex's input has been like very valuable too. And right now I'm taking lessons with J. Allen Jim, who's also like a very good composer and a very interesting mind, who has like all sorts of different interests, and he's very concerned with animals and insects and nature, and like, yeah, those have also been like great influences in my life. But I just find it a little bit hard to think about mentors, as like, I know many composers that think like, oh, my mentor, my one mentor with capital M, that like really like,
Mhm, mhm.
you know, I don't quite feel that way, but I've been very lucky to find very valuable people that now I can call friends, which is like even better for me.
At this note, we're approaching the conclusion of the conversation. So I would only ask you for two more things. One
Hmm.
brief message for anyone aspiring to begin composing.
Hmm.
As much as it's clear that, yes, you're also a composer in development,
Hmm.
nevertheless. And second short message for anyone that will go and listen to one of your compositions online or in a concert even,
Hmm.
and or which piece you would direct them to.
Hmm. Okay, the first one, I will tell them to uh, be as curious as they can, and to question everything, because in this field it's very easy to, there are certain voices that are so powerful and so seductive, that can just like pass all their um, prejudgments to you, and you will never get to see music the way they saw them, which is the reason why they have those prejudgments and those ideas. So if you only like inherit someone else's views, they are there's always something lost in translation, and there's always always going to be a very like partial understanding of music and art. So
Mm-hmm.
I think make everything go through the filter of your intellect and your sensibility. Don't just inherit things from others without questioning them.
Mm.
That would be that would be my comment for someone about to start. And then for someone who's gonna listen to my music, I think all I could say is I'm sorry, and and I hope you find something valuable there.
Carlos, thank you very much for joining this synopsis conversations. It was lovely having you here.
Thank you so much, Neja. It was very nice being here.
Thank you.